This episode is brought to you by Netflix. The MLB at Field of Dreams returns. Bryce Harper and the Philadelphia Phillies face Byron Buxton and the Minnesota Twins at the iconic Field of Dreams ballpark. The field is calling. Watch the MLB at Field of Dreams game live on Netflix Thursday, August 13th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific.
In moments like this, what autocratic movements want to do is they want to get people to not talk about these issues. They want to get people to self-isolate.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. I'm Interfaith Alliance President Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in Massachusetts.
They don't want topics of current events or politics or religion or morality to be the topics around which people gather and talk. And the best thing that we can do is deny that and insist that we are going to talk about our shared future. We are going to talk about our shared values. We are going to talk about our shared politics. We are going to talk about our religious beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, our normative commitments, that what we all can do is insist that we will not self-isolate, that we will come together, and that we will talk about this in our own communities.
The ongoing cruelty campaign that is the Trump administration's approach to immigration enforcement has had one unintended consequence: powerful coalitions born of the moral imperative of resistance. Faith and values-driven groups and individuals have stood bravely together even as deaths multiply. And among the partnerships born in this moment is the work Interfaith Alliance has been doing with the organization Protect Democracy. This week, I'll be talking with Executive Director Ian Bassin. Make sure you listen to the end of the show because you'll hear what Ian has to say about courage in this moment. We need voices like Ian's to be heard now more than others, so please make sure you subscribe, share, and rate The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. Taking a minute to do those things really helps other people discover our show and become listeners too. Our library of past conversations includes almost 200 hopeful, empowering, and inspiring interviews with guests like Simranjit Singh, Mary Bonato, Ressa Aslan, and so many others. You can help us keep growing The State of Belief with a financial contribution right now. Find out how at stateofbelief.com, and you can support and join the work of Interfaith Alliance at interfaithalliance.org. Before we get to our guest, I want to reflect on a headline that I saw on Religion News, which was, "They're not real pastors as clergy run as Democrats. Republicans question their faith." We have seen this in a lot of cases, and I just think it's really interesting. Frankly, I'm not sure anyone can say you're not X religion. I think it's very tempting. I mean, listen, I've been around a lot of Christians who I'm like, why are you saying all of that? Is that real Christianity? But I really don't think that we can just say, because we don't like their politics or we don't like them personally, that we can say, oh, you're not a real Christian, because that's actually not our job. And if you're Jewish, the same thing. I mean, in all of the religions of the world, there are people who say they're not real. They're not real. Well, it's not that easy. People claim religion and people exercise religion as they see fit. And there's never been one way to do any religion. From the first time that people have said they're religious, there have been disagreements. So we can first start with that. But I think what's interesting here underneath this claim that they're calling them Pinos, I guess, pastors in name only. The Republicans are like claiming this because we have the Democratic candidate in Kansas for Senate, I think, is a pastor. And there's a congressional race in Iowa where there's a Democrat who is a pastor. And James Tallarico went to seminary, and all of these people are trained as ministers. They have served in that respect. They're sincere in their beliefs. We have to assume that. So what's interesting here is the uncomfortability of Republicans with the idea that people can actually believe, for instance, in LGBTQ equality or reproductive freedom or broad strokes democracy, where everyone has the right to proclaim their ability to live with dignity. These are actually held, in the case of LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights, they're held by the majority of Christians in this country. It's uncomfortable for people to see people of their own faith espousing other beliefs, but it doesn't mean that they're not real. And certainly it shows there's a kind of panic about it. I actually wrote a piece for Religion News Service about the panic that the religious right has about the visibility of many progressive religious people. For instance, Andy Bashir and talk to Pete Buttigieg. All of these people really have faith, and they're not afraid to talk about it. But I just think like all of us should avoid the temptation to say about people of our own faith tradition, oh, you don't count, because whether you like it or not, they count. It's a question of, can you win the majority of votes in your district? Can you win an election based on your values, based on who you are and how you appeal to as many people as possible? That's democracy, not a litmus test on how you understand God. So just wanted to lift that up. I thought it was interesting, and it maybe indicated something beneath it that I'm just closely watching. And now to my guest. Ian Bassin is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan organization working to safeguard democratic institutions and the rule of law. A former White House counsel and 2023 MacArthur Fellow, he is a leading voice on the challenges facing American democracy today. You've likely seen Ian Bassin's writing in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. And boy, am I delighted to welcome him to the State of Belief. Ian, thank you so much for being with us.
Paul, it's great to see you, and it's great to be on here.
Well, listen, let us start. I have recently heard you speak in various settings. Each time I am inspired, I am also empowered. And I do think that that's part of your message these days. From your TED Talk to what you're talking about right now, you are actually putting in front of our fellow citizens, our friends, our neighbors, the opportunity to make a choice for democracy. And so I just want to start with a great note of appreciation, and also to kind of give you a setup and tell us about the genesis of Protect Democracy. Where did that come from? Why did you feel you had to start it?
Well, as you mentioned before, I had the privilege of serving in the White House, in the White House counsel's office. I had what I guess you would call the democracy portfolio back in 2009, 2010, 2011. Now, we didn't call it that at the time. We called it government reform, because we thought the task before us was simply improving our system of government. I think it's only in hindsight over the last 10 years that we realized that the task was actually saving it, that we were living in a moment in which democracy was under threat, both domestically and around the world, and that threat was growing under our noses when we were doing this work back in 2009, 2010, 2011. And by 2016, I think it became pretty clear to us and to many Americans that the system of government that we had taken for granted, at least in my lifetime, imperfect though it was certainly not permanent or guaranteed. And so we started Protect Democracy out of a recognition that we were living through a generational crisis, a generational challenge to the idea of fair and just democratic governance. And you're right, it is a crisis, but I also like to see it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
There's that adage that people are told, live in interesting times. And we do. We live in interesting times, and we live in times in which we all have a great level of agency and a great opportunity to really lean our shoulders into history and try to change its path for the better. Because out of this moment either is going to come a less democratic time, a more authoritarian time, a time with less freedom, where our children's generation may not grow up with the freedoms that we've known, or, and I believe this to be the outcome that we're trending towards, one with even more. But the question of which of those paths we go down really is up to us. And so I do think it's a great opportunity to live in an interesting time where we could have such an impact on the future.
Well, you gave a really powerful TED Talk in 2023 called How to Spot Authoritarianism and choose democracy. And that's going to what you were just talking about. But it was also, it's bracing. And, I, as also someone who's been out there really talking about authoritarianism, specifically how religion is a tool of authoritarianism, but also can be a tool of democracy and a way that democracy flourishes. One of the things, again, that you talk about is the power of the individual. But I think it would be helpful for our listeners, just to have you rehearse just a little bit. And I do want to encourage everyone to look at that TED Talk, How to Spot Authoritarianism and Choose Democracy. But you lay out so clearly the signs of authoritarianism. And honestly, it is almost like, oh yeah, check, 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 check. But would you mind kind of briefly going through that list and talk about just to recognize really where we are and that there's a playbook that is being used, but it also, there's a way to defeat this. And so we're not going to end there. That's just to set up the next part.
Yeah, I mean, when we started Protect Democracy back in 2016, I went to some of the leading scholars on democracy and authoritarianism. At the time, they were somewhat unknown academics. They have since become best-selling authors, people like Tim Snyder, who wrote On Tyranny, or Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky, who wrote How Democracies Die, or Kim Shepley or Yascha Mounk. And I asked them, if we are going to experience an authoritarian challenge to American democracy, what will it look like? Is there something that you can tell us we should expect based on how we have seen this play out in other countries around the world in the 21st century, whether the threat comes from the left, as it has so often in Latin America, in places like Venezuela, or whether the threat is coming from the right, as it tends to in Eastern Europe, in places like Russia or Hungary? And they said yes. They said there's a very clear playbook for how modern authoritarians unravel and dismantle democracy in the 21st century. And it involves essentially 6 things. It involves, first, the politicization of independent institutions like law enforcement, the civil service, eventually the military. It involves the spreading of disinformation, including from the government. It involves the aggrandizing of executive power, the centralization of power in the executive at the expense of the other institutions that are supposed to also hold power and check power, like legislatures and courts and the free press and the private sector. It involves the quashing of dissent. It often involves the scapegoating of vulnerable groups, right? This has been the tyrant's favorite tool since antiquity, because if you can pit people against each other on the basis of race or religion or sexual orientation, you distract them while you pick their pockets of money and power. And it involves the corruption of elections. Often, if all those things happen, you also get a stoking of violence. And we've seen all of those things play out in the United States over the last several years. And they don't just happen in isolation. They happen as part of a cycle where the autocrats in power use these tools in order to attack people and institutions and organizations that they perceive to stand in the way of their quest for total control and total power. And when they do that, they create a climate of fear. And in that climate of fear, people step back, and institutions that are supposed to play a checking role, our checks and balances, don't do so, because institutions are not marble buildings with ionic columns outside. They're the people inside of them, right? The Supreme Court is nothing without John Roberts. And so when the people in those institutions, when, for example, Senator Lisa Murkowski says we're all afraid up here, well, then the institutions don't do their jobs because people step back and they don't actually check power, and then power gets consolidated. Yeah. And you're right. The good news is, just as that vicious cycle can drive democracy further downwards, there is a virtuous cycle that can reverse it. We've seen it around the world, where initially the most brave actors, the tip of the spear, step up and challenge those who would attack democracy. They do the thing that the fearful don't do, right? And we've seen that. We've seen Alex Priddy and Renee Good, citizens who are willing, in the face of incredible intimidation and scary tactics, give the ultimate sacrifice in order to demonstrate that people can make a difference. And when masses of people, broad coalitions come in behind those brave initial actors to get their backs, just as so many tens of thousands of Minnesotans did, following the example of Alex Purdy and Renee Good, flooding the streets of Minneapolis in negative 22-degree weather, stopping businesses and schools, shutting down the entire state in order to say to the federal government, we will no longer cooperate with your invasion of our cities and our towns. Then all of a sudden people feel emboldened to check power, and the institutions do their jobs, and the authoritarian cycle is disrupted. So we know that there is a playbook for pushing back, and we've seen such incredibly inspiring examples of our own neighbors doing it.
That, I think there were a lot of moments. I mean, even in its own kind of benign, and some people would say, it wasn't particularly impactful, but even things like No Kings, where people like deciding, no, we're not going to be afraid to be public about our dissent. And they tried to paint it as violent, and they tried to paint it as un-American and all that kind of stuff. And yet people still showed up. And I do think Minnesota was a moment where like the sense of inevitability was reversed, and the folks had to back down, and of course that's where also religion has played a really important part. And I'm very proud of the collaboration, the partnership between Interfaith Alliance and Protect Democracy, specifically on the Choose Love Not ICE campaign. We started that actually, like not long actually. I'm trying to remember. I think it was maybe before the Minnesota, but we put out an ad that just really asking people to choose love, not ICE, and juxtaposing the faith ideal of loving your neighbor, the faith ideal of loving across difference, with the incredible violence and disregard for law that ICE was demonstrating, and millions and millions of people shared that video, and we've had two very beautiful ads since then. So I just would love to, first of all, thank you for such a wonderful collaboration, but also, recognizing the strong role that religion can play, as I said before, in both reinforcing the authoritarian playbook, but also in actually having a vision and mobilizing people for another way.
We were so grateful to do it with you, Paul. And I think the reason it was so important for us was because there is an assumption when people are thinking about these attacks on democracy, these attacks on our institutions, these attacks on elections. We're sitting here talking about this today, a week after the president gave a nationally televised address, spinning up all sorts of false conspiracy theories as part of his attack on the midterm elections. There's an assumption that the response to all of this is technical and legal, that the defenses are going to be in the courts, or the defenses are going to be in legislatures. And those institutions have a role to play for sure. The courts are going to play a key role. Legislatures are going to play a key role. But at the end of the day, it's not courts of law that are going to determine which future, the darker one or the brighter one, we go down. It is going to be the courts of public opinion. It is going to be where the people are. And I think that is, if you look back at history, are moments where we have been faced with a crucible of crisis and somehow overcome them to deliver, as I think we have in this country repeatedly, greater democracy on the backside of our biggest crises. Those moments have been accompanied by revivals of faith, both religious faith and civic faith. All the great movements for democracy, for civil rights, for perfecting our union have come hand in glove with a movement about what our country is about, what our values are, what our communities care about. You and I wrote about this when we released the first of those videos. And so I think that the videos that we've done together that are about what are our national values, what is our national story, what are the morals that underpin the society we want to live in, are more important even than the court victories. And it's also why I think, I think the No King stuff has been really impactful and important, because if you go back to early 2025, there was a sense that a more authoritarian, illiberal vision of the United States was ascendant, not just as the result of elections, but not just as the result of law, but as the result almost of a cultural zeitgeist, that we were living in a moment when being mean, being cruel was the coin of the realm and was where our country was heading spiritually, emotionally, directionally. And that both had the effect of empowering, I think, an authoritarian governing model, but also kind of chilling and intimidating those who didn't share those values from stepping into the public square and saying, we hold different values. And I think what No Kings has done and what our ads did together is to say, no, actually, those of us who still believe in caring for one's neighbor, in wanting a safer, brighter future for our community's children, in wanting a planet that we can pass on to the next generation, in believing that honesty and decency and kindness are values that we think matter and should be central to our society, that we still are a powerful voice in the society. And I think through the things we've done together, the things we've seen out there, even the majority voice in this country.
Absolutely.
And I think that all of this work that we're doing outside of courts, outside of legislatures, is critical to reminding all of us that those values are still American values, and they are values that can dictate the future.
Yeah. Well, I just want to just touch back on the piece we wrote together, which I really thank you for that collaboration and for the inspiration that you provided for that. Was, it was titled "We Need a Next Great Awakening," and it was so helpful and it struck so many people. That you and I, coming from different places as far as our our organizing and kind of professional backgrounds, might come to that conclusion. And I actually, given my kind of, with the No Kings, with all of the places I've been and the incredible conversations I've been a part of and the gatherings that have always exceeded by 3-4x times what was anticipated, I started changing that to like, we are witnessing a next great awakening, which was like, it's not going to be how we understood great awakenings in the past, which is like in a Christian context, which is like a Christian revival, but rather a broad spirituality of the people, of democracy. And that is from different faith traditions alongside people who hold deep moral values without a religious tradition. Up next, more with Protect Democracy's Ian Bassin. You're going to want to keep listening for his take on what is at stake in this midterm election. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe and share and rate this show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet. Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is Ian Bassin, Executive Director of Protect Democracy. I'm excited about this time, even as I'm terrified of this time and what is in front of us. One of the things that I got to listen to give a talk recently that was just so smart. And it's one of those things where you're like, oh, I'm listening to something really smart and I want more people to hear what this really smart guy is saying. And that was about how you understood our moment with this election and how we really need to be thinking of it, understanding that this is part of the authoritarian playbook. And again, that we're not powerless in the face of it. So would you be willing to give us, the broad contours of how you understand this moment as we go into the 2026 midterm elections?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing to recognize is that authoritarianism, generally speaking, tends not to be very popular. Now, people choose something that might deprive them of choice and control initially out of frustration. There are moments when the system doesn't seem to be delivering well-being for people. And those are moments, oftentimes there could be a moment of rapid change, destabilization, where there's an opening for a demagogue to come in and say, I know the system isn't working. It's all rigged. It's all corrupt. It's hurting you. These other people are to blame, but I can fix it. And that's a very tempting thing that human civilizations throughout history have been tempted by. I know people, who believed in the utopianism offered by Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua because he seemed like he was going to be the salvation for a country that was not delivering for people. And so people hand over their power to these demagogues. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. And then lo and behold, those demagogues really are there to consolidate power and take control away from the people. And by the time the people realize that, they don't like it anymore. They don't like being deprived of agency or control. And in those moments, they might, in a fair democracy, simply say, hey, that was a mistake. We're going to vote these people out, which is why those authoritarians need at that moment to say, yeah, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to tilt the playing field and control the elections to entrench ourselves in power. And we're seeing an effort to do that here in the United States today. And it has a very clear structure to it. To make it alliterative, we've assigned it 3 Ds: deceive, disrupt, and deny. Deceive, disrupt, and deny. And this is what we are currently experiencing here in the United States, where the president is deploying these 3 Ds in order to tilt the playing field in this election away from where all of the political indicators suggest it is going, which is that people in 2024 decided they wanted something fundamentally different. They were tempted by a vision that was on offer, and then now 2 years into it have decided they don't like it, and they want to go a different direction. That's just what the data tells us. And so in a normal cycle, you would see a pendulum swing away from the results of the 2024 election in a different direction, except for the fact that the autocrat in chief is trying to tilt the playing field in order to deny the people the ability to change course from where they went in 2024. And so the way deceive, disrupt, deny works is first is deception, because in a distributed system like ours, the founders' wisdom was not to allow presidents to control elections. The founders understood that if you allowed presidents to control elections, they would be tempted to rig those elections to entrench themselves in power. And so the founders distributed the power over elections to states and localities. So our elections are run locally by states and localities, and there's no role for the president to play. And so if an autocratic-minded president does want to tilt the playing field in an election, he needs accomplices to do so. He can't do it himself. The president found this out in 2020 when he needed Brad Raffensperger, for example, in Georgia, to quote-unquote find him 11,000 votes, or when he needed courts to hand him an election he'd lost, or members of Congress to vote to reject Electoral College certificates, or even today, where he realizes he's asking the United States Senate to abrogate the filibuster, to pass the SAVE Act. He needs accomplices throughout the system. And most of the people throughout the system who oversee our elections don't wake up in the morning wanting to corrupt the electoral process, whether they be nonpartisan election administrators or elected Democrats or elected Republicans. They want to run a fair process. And in order to get them to do something corrupt, he needs to deceive either them or their base of supporters and voters into thinking that there's something fundamentally wrong and broken that needs to be fixed. And so the president is out there spinning up every conspiracy theory under the sun that, non-citizens are voting at massive rates. Not true. That dead Chinese phantoms have infected our voting machines, that aliens have landed from the planet Neptune and are stealing our elections, or that Cookie Monster has eaten all of the ballots. I kid you not, right? This is the kind of deception that's going on right now. And it's all designed to convince people that something's broken, that needs fixing, so that the pressure would then be put on these accomplices to disrupt, to then change the rules, change the laws, and tilt the playing field. And then if that fails, the last move is denial. This is what we saw in 2020, when if the preferred outcome is not to the autocrats' liking, they simply deny the results and say, oh no, that was stolen. That's not actually the results. And so we're living through the midst of that right now. And the good news is we have survived this before. We can survive it again. The antidote to the deception is truth, right? And we're seeing that now. The president went out the other day and gave this rambling conspiracy grievance-laden address. And I think, thankfully, the American public, the American media has caught on to it. And the response to that was, nonsense. That's a bunch of gibberish.
Yeah, one of our producers actually noticed that the Drudge Report didn't even acknowledge the talk.
It really landed with a whimper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're seeing responses on the other fronts as well. On the disruption front, the courts are stepping in and basically saying no to a lot of it, not all of it, to a lot of it. And on the denial front, that's where it really is going to be up to all of us. If in fact the American people assert their will and choose, as they may, they have the freedom to do, to go in a direction that is not to the autocrat's liking, and he tries to deny that result, then it will be up to all of us to follow in the footsteps of our brothers and sisters in Minnesota and say we will not cooperate with an effort to take away our agency.
Yeah. I think that, one of the things that's a little scary is that it felt like in 2020, there were people around him who were like, this, it's over. We lost. And now we have kind of the federal government entirely weaponized, and many of the people who might have pushed back on it, even in the state level, being sidelined. Do you have, how do we understand this moment? And then I want to get into a lot of what we're thinking must be done between now and November to make sure that the power is there to thwart these, the deceive, the disrupt, and the deny. But how do you feel like the landscape of personnel and personalities is different in 2020 and 2026? Well,
you're right. This is the core thesis and insight in a report that we put out called Executive Override about the president's efforts to undermine the integrity of our elections. You can get it at protectdemocracy.org/DDD. Deceive, disrupt, deny. And what the report basically says is the point that you just made, that in 2020, most of the apparatus of the federal government was working in opposition to the president's attempt to corrupt the election. And now all of the people who would stand in the way, for the most part, have been replaced with loyalists who are actually trying to advance the president's election corruption scheme. And so that is different this time around. And it means the threat is perhaps more serious. But again, the federal executive branch doesn't control elections. And so even though the federal executive is working now in tandem across the executive branch to undermine our elections, they are doing so from a place of weakness, because that branch of our government doesn't really have much of a role to play with respect to elections. And so that means that even though it is more empowered than it was in 2020, it is not the dominant actor here. The dominant actors here are the states, the localities, the courts even, and all of us. And so it is going to require more concerted effort by all of us. It is going to require a stronger response from the courts and the states, but it is still a weak hand to be trying to deploy the federal executive to undermine our elections. A threat, no doubt, but a threat that can be defeated.
Well, this is where there's a few ways that, we've been, again, with Protect Democracy, we've been doing some scenario planning and preparing, faith leaders to really think through, like, what will our role be? Because faith leaders still do have trust of many in the American populace. So how, some of the ways we're thinking about this is actually like part of our job is actually to counteract this, this deceive, in some ways to help be a voice saying, actually, our elections are not rigged, are fair, are not fraud riddled, and be a voice out there. And that's like one really clear thing that I think faith leaders can do, is to begin to really inspire trust and saying, no, that's not that's not true. We're going to say what's true, and we're going to use our pulpits, but also the public square, op-eds, and things like that. Another thing that is, really, really important right now is to make contact with, I think, election officials and say, hey, we've got your back. If you experience pressure, we will bring 1,000 faith folks out to say, actually stand your ground. I think that there's lots of ways that faith communities can show up right now for our democracy in a nonpartisan way. None of this is actually partisan work. And then, I think the last thing that a lot of us are thinking about and a lot of us are fearful of is the role, and this goes back to our collaboration around ICE, is the role that kind of a militarized, ICE, but also National Guard might play in intimidation of the vote. And I'm curious how you're understanding that last threat. And if there are any particular, asks you would make of faith communities vis-a-vis a kind of militarized presence around polling spaces.
Yeah, so I think you did a great job there of naming a number of things that faith communities can do. The first, obviously, is help congregants understand how the process works, because the more people understand about local election processes, the greater trust they have in them. When people meet their local election clerk, the local team that's overseeing their elections, their neighbors, and understand the process that's involved, people have much more faith because they realize that people in their own communities are there getting ballots out, making sure ballots are counted properly, making sure the elections are run smoothly. It's not some far away sort of foreign shadow
deep
effort.
State.
That's right. And so
it's your neighbor.
It's your neighbor. So I think, communities of faith can do a good job bringing people together for, as you say, nonpartisan information learning sessions on how it works, which really helps to inoculate people against the lies and the conspiracy theories. I love the way in which faith communities work together across divides and differences. Obviously, we love working with you at Interfaith Alliance. Your peer organization, Interfaith America, put out a project with us a couple of years ago called the Faith and Elections Toolkit, which is a lot of good quality information there that people can use to help people understand the process better. The second piece that you alluded to, getting the backs of our elected officials and our local election workers. They're under enormous pressure and under enormous threats. And you wouldn't believe the value in just reaching out and saying, thank you. We see you. We appreciate what you're doing. We have lost so many election workers in the last several years because of how deeply difficult and scary at times their job has been. And I think just reaching out and giving them support.
Let me just reference your TED Talk, because you mentioned 2 election workers who really suffered terrible consequences. And, I don't have an update on them, but, these were 2 election workers in Georgia who were targeted by by Donald Trump and had to go into hiding for just doing something that was like a civic duty. I mean, I just think like that is like, I get so angry when I think about it, but Matt, can you just talk a little bit about them? Because they were also heroes.
They were Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, who were falsely targeted by the president simply for doing their jobs and helping the voters of Georgia to vote, to have their ballots counted. They were so proud to be part of the process of helping people, their neighbors, to vote. They just wanted to be of service to their neighbors in a democracy, and they were targeted for it. And you're right, they became heroes because they refused to sit down. And they stood up and talked about what happened. They sued the people who had spread lies about them. They testified before the January 6th committee about what happened to them. And what they have said they want out of the ordeal they went through is to inspire other people to follow in their footsteps and help our democracy work. And so if to honor that, the other thing that people can do, in addition to thanking their election workers, is become an election worker yourself. There's a great org called Power the Polls. You can find them at powerthepolls.org, which allows you to sign up to become an election worker where you live, to get trained on how to do it, and to do what Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss did, which is serve their community by making democracy work and helping people to vote. And that's another thing that faith communities, it's entirely nonpartisan, it's public service, and it's helping to refill the ranks of election workers for those we've lost over the last years, either because of how much more tense it has been to do that job, but also because of the pandemic, which frankly eliminated a whole generation of election workers who couldn't man elections during the pandemic. And now we need to restock the ranks with people who are going to learn how to do this for the next generation. And then the last piece of this, of course, as you mentioned, is what if we do experience the deployment of ICE or the deployment of militarized National Guard or other forces to communities? And here, I think what we have seen is when that has been done over the last 2 years, it really has politically backfired. Nobody wants the military policing their communities. Nobody wants the kind of all-out siege that we saw in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota. And when from a weak position, an autocrat tries to project strength like that and is exposed, particularly by communities of faith, for the immorality of that sort of heavy-handed approach to our communities and our neighbors, it politically backfires. And so I think there's a role to play here, as our organizations tried to play with Choose Love, Not ICE, to juxtapose the morality that most people have, the vision that we all have of the kind of values that we want to animate our societies, with the ugliness of a heavy-handed militarized deployment to our communities. And when we hold up that mirror and show people what's being done in our names to our communities, and people recoil because of the immorality of it, it actually works like a political rake where it snaps back in the face of the people who deployed it. And I think it is important for our faith communities to point out that that sort of approach to governance in a free country is inconsistent with who we are, and make that immorality really stand out.
I love the rake metaphor. It is another just moment for me to just pitch to all of our listeners that, one thing that you can do right now is get trained up in nonviolent mobilization, and Interfaith Alliance is doing that across the country. We also have asynchronistic trainings that are available on our website at Interfaith Alliance/training. And there are so many amazing trainings out there. It really is this, I think this whole conversation with Ian is about you can do something. I mean, it really, and because it's only if we, the people, stand down and say, okay, well, there's nothing I can do, that this can go forward.
If I may, I love that you're doing that because, people should remember that when the Freedom Riders were riding through the South to support voting rights for Black communities in the South, they were trained before doing that about methods of nonviolence and how to brave an incredibly, both spiritually, brave what can be an intimidating and scary scenario, and also how to respond when receiving all of the vitriol and the racism and the hatred and the ugliness that they faced on doing that. And it's a great example of where carrying out this nonviolent de-escalatory approach can call out the immorality of those who are attacking you. The Voting Rights Act, remember, gets passed on the back of the march over the bridge in Selma, where Americans witnessed on their TV screens people peacefully marching and getting beaten by an earlier version of the kind of militarized approach to democracy and freedom that we're experiencing again today. And it was when people saw the militarized approach of the forces in Selma being deployed against fellow Americans that the country rose up and said, no more, we're not going to allow this anymore. And I think it was trainings like that that really helped that generation do it. And we're being called on again to step up in that way.
100%. It is, and that was a really important part of really all the activism that's been happening in the last couple of years, even including the No Kings, just the emphasis on nonviolence, the emphasis on discipline. We, a couple of weeks ago, had a a whole episode about John Lewis, celebrating the legacy of John Lewis, and John Lewis really was the embodiment of this idea of nonviolence, and it's again, one of the the through lines here is that you don't have to ask permission to be a part of any of this. It's actually it is this moment is waiting for you. One of the things I do want to just go back to, which I think is another part of the faith community and the interfaith work that we do, is this part of scapegoating and demonizing communities. And specifically, I do think we're going to pit these communities against us, one another, whether it's Jewish and Muslim or Christian and trans. We're going to decide that there's a false dichotomy. Either you're going to win or the other one's going to win. And so you have to, choose sides, give up your agency, give up, some of the democratic ideals that you might have in order to be safe or to make sure you prevail. And I think one of the things that we've been so intentional about at Interfaith Alliance is saying, actually, we all have to work together for all of us to survive together. And so I appreciate you naming that as part of the authoritarian playbook, because we forget, the attack on trans people, for instance, it's such a small part of an American society, and yet it's played such a huge role of this very, very oppressed minority of people who are have been deemed such a threat. And likewise with Muslims and Jews, and there's just such a rise in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and real violence towards these communities. I wonder how does that fit in, right now, also with everything you're seeing and with the vote and with broader democracy movement. I just think it's important to kind of underline that.
You look back on the fights between labor and management in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the early days of the 20th century. And management realized that if it could pit labor against one another, get the Italians and the Irish fighting, get the Italians and the Irish fighting with the black workers, they could prevent unionization. They could prevent the workers from finding that they actually had more in common that divided them and holding power to account. And you see the same thing play out politically with these autocratic movements, right? They're always finding some scapegoat to blame, whether it is a xenophobic argument that gets made against immigrants coming into the community, as Eastern Europe has tried to do, and a lot of the sort of more illiberal authoritarian movements across Europe have done, whether it is trying to scapegoat the LGBTQ community, as both Viktor Orban did and Vladimir Putin did and Donald Trump has done, whether it is a misogynistic approach, which is a huge part of a lot of these modern authoritarian movements. You see it in Brazil with Bolsonaro, just as you saw it in the U.S. with Donald Trump, a deeply misogynistic movement.
Or Hegseth saying, we need more tea. I mean, it's the craziest thing.
It is always basically trying to say someone else out there is to blame, and I can identify them with what they look like or who they love or the color of their skin or the language they speak or where they come from, and that's your enemy, not me. And that distraction is often what is used to then allow the demagogue to seize more money and power for themselves. Vladimir Putin was making himself incredibly rich while trying to spin up Russia against the phantom that somehow the LGBT community was to blame for people's immiseration. It's a distraction, and we, I think, all of us can help call that out and not allow that distraction to happen.
I think that's where, again, the love your neighbor basic thing, and that's actually, Minnesota really came into this idea of neighbornessism. It was almost like they were like, this is really what we're about. I generally start with this, but I'm going to end with this. A little bit more about you. I'm sorry. I feel like I've just made you into your position right now. But where do you come from? What's your background? Where did are you what's your family? What was the inspiration for this life of service?
So I'm a New Yorker through and through. I'm a fourth generation New Yorker. And I grew up in New York during what prior to the present moment really had been kind of the prior peak homelessness crisis in New York in the 1970s, 1980s. And I remember at the time, my parents got divorced. I spent a lot of time kind of outside of the house as that was happening, kind of walking the streets of my neighborhood. And some of the kindest, most thoughtful adults that I encountered were some of the men who were sleeping in cardboard boxes on my street. And I contrasted them with a moment in New York City where it was the me generation. It was a lot of wealth, living the high life. I was very fortunate. I went to an incredibly good school that my grandparents were committed to paying for me to go to. And um, I saw some of the titans of industry who had all the wealth and goods that money could buy, um, but didn't always have the best values, didn't always have a sense of public-mindedness and public service. And I remember contrasting um, the values I saw from those who had everything and the values I saw from those who seemed, at least according to the way our society measures it, to have nothing. And it struck me that somehow we were not rewarding uh, in a meritorious way those who had the right values. And so it led me to ask a lot of questions about how we organized a decision about who to empower, who to ennoble, who to provide material resources to and rewards to, and why. And that led me to asking questions about democracy and how we make decisions about how to allocate our resources. And thankfully, I was given such a privileged education that when I asked those questions, I had wonderful teachers who sought to answer them. And it led me down a road of trying to be part of how do we make decisions in our society to reward the right values, the kind of values that would make us more of the shining city upon a hill that we aspire to be. And so that
Mm.
led me down this path, and it's still the path that I'm on.
Yeah, I'm raising my kids in New York City, and it's a really interesting, um, it's an interesting, kind of wow, arena in which because my kids ask every day, like, why aren't you giving them money? Like they're like confronted just on the way to school, the 3 blocks to school. I mean, they see it all, and it is a wonderful place and a great, an inspiring place, but a challenging place to figure out like what are values, how are we living out our values, and it's fascinating. So, thank you for that. The last question I would love to ask you is just the one I'm asking everyone is, what does courage look like to you right now?
Um, Participating and not being deterred from engaging publicly on issues of the old adage goes, right? When you go to dinner, don't mention politics or religion. Well, you and I like to talk about both. And in moments like this, what autocratic movements want to do is they want to get people to not talk about these issues. They want to get people to self-isolate. They want to get people to obey in advance. They don't want topics of current events or politics or religion or morality to be the topics around which people gather and talk. And the best thing that we can do is deny that and insist that we are going to talk about our shared future. We are going to talk about our shared values. We are going to talk about our shared politics. We are going to talk about our religious beliefs, our spiritual beliefs, our normative commitments, that what we all can do is insist that we will not self-isolate, that we will come together, and that we will talk about this in our own communities. So whether you do it at work, whether you do it in your houses of worship, whether you do it in your neighborhood community gatherings, whether that be school gatherings or sports gatherings or block parties, make sure that you're the person who says, hey, can we talk about what's happening in this country and what we want to see happen in this country? That is the most courageous thing you can do. I think if you do it, you will find there are other people there who want to talk about it too. And in that lies our strength.
Ian Bassin heads up Protect Democracy, a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to defending democratic institutions, the rule of law, and free and fair elections. Interfaith Alliance is proud to call Protect Democracy a partner in our work. As our tagline puts it, we are achieving democracy together. Ian, thank you so much for being with us today on This State of Belief.
Thank you, Paul.
Who do you know who would get a lot out of this conversation with Ian Bassin? I know you know someone who needs to hear this. So please share The State of Belief with them, and be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast platform. We need your help to continue growing The State of Belief, so please make a financial contribution today at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.